So they would destroy the trees, the grapevines, and make sure that, they couldn't harvest anything. And this actually happened when I was there. We were there to try to protect the farmers. Well, the Israeli army would come out and they would say, you guys get out of here. So they would not do anything to the settlers. And basically they would attack people like me who were there to protect the farmers.
Welcome to Fight Back Radio, production of fightbacknews.org, taking you to the heart of the people's struggle. I'm your host, Richard Berg, and today we're going to talk about a number of different things that may seem, as I mentioned them, a little disparate, but they all actually do, in fact, fit together. We're going to talk a little bit about Palestine, which was in the news for a year and a half or so in a big way, and now with Trump's doing so much different, just so many attacks and so many different peoples and so much craziness in his administration, has put Palestine in the back pages of the news a little bit. But we're going to talk about some of the history of Palestine, how we got there, and a little bit what's going on now as well. But also we're going to talk about Ireland. We're going to talk about Islam. We're going to talk about the Black Liberation Movement. And some, variety of international situation issues, and all of this comes together with our guest, who is Bill Chambers, who just wrote a book, which I will hold up for those of you watching on YouTube, called "My Chicago Activist Life: From Ireland to Palestine, 1968 to 2025." And Bill Chambers is by introduction, is a full-time activist with a long history in the civil rights, anti-racism, anti-war, Irish Republican, and Palestinian Solidarity work. As part of his activist work, Bill has traveled extensively to Ireland and Palestine to meet and work with community organizations. He has published multiple articles for the Electronic Intifada, Palestine in America, the Muslim Journal, Muslim Matters, and the Chicago Monitor. And he's published on Islamophobia, surveillance of Muslims, social justice groups, Palestine Solidarity campaigns, Black Lives Matter, and the movement for community control of the police. He is currently a member of the Masjid al-Taqwa. I got that.
Good. Masjid al-Taqwa.
Thank you, and I apologize to the people that are part of that mosque in Chicago, and part of the Imam W. Dean Muhammad community, the Muslim Anti-Racist Collective, and the Chicago Irish for Palestine. Also, just to continue, we could go on for a long time about all of his accolades, all the things that he's done. But besides his regular street cred, he has a bachelor's degree in English from Northwestern University, a master's in English from Tufts University, a master's from the Islamic Studies, a master's in Islamic Studies from American Islamic College, and a diploma in Irish Studies from the University of Galway. And so,
and I can add that currently I'm working on a master's degree in Gaelic literature and culture at the University College Cork.
So an experienced and well-educated guest. Welcome to Fight Back Radio, Bill.
Thanks very much, Richard.
Yes. So I want to start out with Palestine. And as I said, it's fallen out of the news a little bit, but the repression there is long-standing back from 1949 when the Nakba, well, before that even, and persists to today. But the repression and the deaths are daily. If you do bother to look to the back pages of the newspaper. But I want to talk about you became an activist and you've traveled to Palestine many times. 4 times you talk about in your book, and I thought it might be helpful to talk about your trips to Palestine and what the purposes were and what you saw there, and those kind of things. So why don't we start out with your first trip to Palestine? And, even like if you could talk a little bit about, going to Palestine, it's just even the travel arrangements and getting into the country. If you want to actually see something, it's a little different than if you, travel to any other country, probably.
Absolutely.
So could you talk a little bit about that, Bill?
Sure. So at the time when I was going to Palestine, I was in a group called Palestine Solidarity group. And we'll talk later about how that group got kind of repressed and so on. But our group sent delegations to Palestine every year. And those delegations had teachers, students, videographers, lawyers, just about any kind of range of people that you could think of. And the whole purpose of those trips was for activists. So in other words, they were there to meet with Palestinian organizations, lots of civic groups and so on, and then see what was really going on in Palestine, and then come back and become active in the Palestine liberation movement. So and this was my first trip to Palestine. And one of the things, like Richard said, it's unlike going to any other country. If even at that time, if they thought you were there on any kind of activist delegation, they wouldn't let you in the country. And at one point, they were kicking people out and you couldn't come back for 10 years and so on. So when we went there, we did not travel together. We traveled like individually. I was the very old white-haired guy, and I had my, trip guide to the Holy Land in my luggage, because often they would search your luggage to find out where you were all about. And this is one thing that I mention a lot in my book. I always believed in using my white privilege. So if you're a white person out there, instead of feeling guilty or I don't know, whatever, use your white privilege to get into places that they'll let you in. And this was a good example because we did have Palestinians on the trip, and the Palestinians would be questioned for 8-9 hours, and they would just pass me through. So, and they, see me as this old guy or whatever. So a lot of, on that first trip, to summarize it the best, I was shocked, and as most people are, when you go to Palestinians towns like Bethlehem, they're completely surrounded by what we would call the apartheid wall, which looks like a German concentration camp wall. We met with the mayor of Nablus is a good example. There were a number of mayors that tried to do like a nonviolent pushback on the Israelis building the wall through their towns or their farmland or so on.
These are Palestinian elected officials?
Palestinian elected officials that were like mayors of Nablus or Ramallah or whatever it might be. Well, at that time when we were talking to him, he was in a wheelchair and had no legs. And what had happened was the Israelis their response to any type of nonviolent organization, resistance, whatever, was violence. So the Israelis at one point put a bomb underneath his car and blew off his legs. Wow. So, and then we continued various other places, and you could see the Palestinians were very much oppressed. There were Israeli roadblocks almost everywhere. It was very hard for them to get to one town to another, even might have been half an hour away. It might take them hours. And that was our first meeting with the group. Go ahead.
If you were a Zionist, if you were Jewish in this occupied Palestinian West Bank, and you said it took hours to get from one town to the other. If I wanted to make the same trip, how long would that take?
Well, if you wanted to take the same trip or you were an Israeli, they had special Israeli roads that were concrete and all that. And it would maybe take 20 minutes and it would take you hours. So a lot of what we saw was this complete denial of any kind of rights. And now I'm talking about the West Bank right now. The West Bank is completely under military control and military law. So any Palestinian can be picked up for anything and detained as long as they want. And this is something they still do to this day. And also we got interviews with some of the people who were supporting Palestinian prisoners. They're continually tortured. And I'll talk about on my next trip a little bit more about that. That torture, we see that going on even today. There's been reports that people they've picked up in Gaza weren't doing anything. They were just there, and they've put them into detention centers, which are really prisoners, and they're literally tortured. They're either beaten up, not provided medical equipment or food or anything like that.
Wow. Okay. Well, why don't we go into that a little bit? I mean, your next trip. So you had, or if you want to say anything else on the first trip before we wrap up, what your impressions were of that. But then your second trip was you went back like a year later or something, and so it was relatively quickly. Why don't you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure. Just as a lead into that, and this is very relevant. One of the things I noticed on the first trip, and it's very important when people come up to you and say, well, it's a democratic country and there are Palestinians within Israel and they have rights. Completely not true. The Palestinians that live within Israel have very little rights in terms of even voting, owning land, getting married, and I could go on and on and on. So if somebody tells you, well, it's a democratic country, and people, that's absolutely not true. The lead into this, my second trip, I went with a Palestinian lawyer from New York and her family, and our purpose of that trip was to think of them as depositions from Palestinian prisoners who had been tortured. And I'll give you just one quick example that has always stayed with me. Now, remember, you could be picked up for almost anything. Flying a Palestinian flag, that's illegal. You're at some kind of demonstration, that's illegal. You happen to be around when some bomb occurred, they're going to pick you up and keep you there for a long time. In this case, it was a 15-year-old girl. She was within Israel, called her friend who was in the West Bank. They didn't like that. And she was arrested, spent 6, 7, 8 months in jail.
Just for making a telephone.
Just for making that telephone call.
Oh
because they were very worried about, you're contacting terrorists in the West Bank, blah, blah, blah. And yeah, she was tortured, denied food. They would threaten her, say, I'm going to arrest your parents unless you give us names of people. The thing I was very proud, and this is one of the things that I mentioned in my book, there's been a lot of resistance successes. And one of the things that she did, here's a 15-year-old girl, she led a hunger strike for the female prisoners, and eventually she was released. But that whole idea of you could expect just about any Palestinian who is arrested for these very minor things would be tortured, or their parents would be brought in, or somebody else in their family, a lot of psychological torture. And that's still going on.
Yeah. Oh my God. Yeah. I mean, it's and 15 years old, just making a phone call. That's incredible. There's also party. Maybe you can talk a little bit about this. They talk about collective punishment in Palestine. Could you say what that is and what a little bit about that?
Yeah. So one of the biggest collective punishments, and I would call it, now it's turned into genocide, is what's going on in Gaza. So this kind of idea that, there were a certain number of Hamas fighters that, had fights with the Israelis and took some hostages and so on, very long time ago. Everybody that's in Gaza, according to them, is a terrorist, whether they're a civilian, they're a doctor, or a journalist, or so on. And we all have heard in the news about all that bombing going on. This idea of collective punishment has been going on for years and years and years. The one thing a lot of people don't remember is that this is, I think, the 6th war on Gaza. And all of them involve collective punishment. So maybe one militant group would fire a missile, and then the whole Israeli army would come in and they'd bomb civilian targets and so on. And let's say it's a town, and this is very was happening when I was there. Let's say it's a village that's resisting the building of the wall that I talked about, like through their land, and they were protesting it. Well, the IDF, which is we call it the Israeli occupation forces, they would come into that town and arrest, let's say, any male between like 12 and 30 and just take them in, or they would come in and smash up, houses or whatever, or beat up the farmers, or let the settlers beat up the farmers. So that type of thing, and that people need to realize that has been going on for probably 60 years. And I saw a lot of that when I was there. And that was, a few years ago.
Yeah. No, I've seen on the different, I don't remember where it reported, but even during the Intifada, they'd have kids throwing rocks and they'd blow up their families' houses and things like that.
Yeah. Yeah. One real quick example on one of my trips that we were sent out to a village because the settlers, and it's very important to talk about the settlers too. I always compare them to like the Ku Klux Klan living on a hill above a black neighborhood. So they would come down and burn the farmers' fields.
So these are Israeli settlers who are really stealing the land from
they're already stealing the land, and their way of gathering more land is to prevent the Israeli, in this case, Israeli farmers from growing anything. So, and a lot of times they would cut down olive trees. In this case,
so these are farms that Palestinians own?
These are farms that Palestinians own, and they've been there for generations.
Okay.
So they would destroy the trees, the grapevines, and make sure that, they couldn't harvest anything. And this actually happened when I was there. We were there to try to protect the farmers. Well, the Israeli army would come out and they would say, you guys get out of here. So they would not do anything to the settlers, and basically they would attack people like me who were there to protect the farmers.
Oh my God. Yeah. Well, there's a famous thing with this woman named Rachel Corrie who was protecting land. Could you tell us a little bit about that story?
Yeah, the Rachel Corrie was a young woman. She was part of the International Solidarity movement, and there's been multiple campaigns to stop Israel from bulldozing homes and bulldozing whole neighborhoods. And she was one of the people. What the International Solidarity movement would do is they'd bring people from the United States and Europe and so on, and they would stand in front of these houses to try to protect them from the bulldozers. In Rachel Corrie's case, even though she had a reflective vest and all that, the guy in the bulldozer just ran over her.
Wow.
And you know he did see her, but he didn't care.
Didn't care.
Yeah.
You see that it's gotten even worse. A couple of weeks ago, I saw there was first responders in Gaza responding to whatever the most recent tragedy was there. And the Israelis bombed them, the responders. And then they came afterwards and they just bulldozed them all under. It was the United Nations.
A mass. Yeah, it became a mass grave. And there is evidence that they literally shot them, like at close range.
Incredible.
So it's overall, if you think of the Israeli way of doing wars, doesn't matter if you're a civilian. It doesn't matter if you're in a hospital. It doesn't matter if you're in a church, mosque, school. They have a history of bombing all of those, civilian infrastructures, and that is by design. They're trying to destroy the Palestinian people.
Yeah. I want to move to your third trip to Palestine. Now, this one you were going to visit your son, who was, if I'm right, correct me if I'm wrong, he was involved in some of the resistance to the apartheid wall that's being built throughout the West Bank and other parts of Israel, Palestine. Could you talk a little bit about what the apartheid wall is, and then also what you saw in this third visit?
Yeah, so the apartheid wall was built, it must be 20 years ago now. It's an extremely tall concrete wall. I mean, most of it is concrete. And the idea, supposedly, was to stop terrorists from coming into Israel. Actually, it was a way of grabbing more and more Palestinian land. So if you see the apartheid wall and there are extensions of it, sometimes it'll go right through a village. And what happens, people at the village, maybe their farmland is on the other side of the wall. Well, the Israelis, too bad. You don't have access to that anymore. So my son was there during the summer and worked for and this was a nonviolent resistance Palestinian group. And every weekend, they would go and protest the wall that was being expanded into their village and into their farmland. And they were always met by Israeli soldiers. In the beginning, it was tear gas, and then it escalated to live bullets. And what happened to my son, you would figure, like I talked about earlier, he's a young white American and all that type of thing. Well, they're not going to do anything to him. Well, they grabbed him, put a black hood over his head, threw him in a Jeep, and then took him to some detention center. And he was there overnight in the dark and that kind of thing. And then they just released him the next morning. So it's also obviously the Palestinians are under the most duress and repression, and they're being killed and maimed and put in jail. But it's also very true that increasingly any type of activists that try to go over there, they're fair game.
Yeah. Well, I'm zooming along here a little bit, but I want to go to your fourth trip, which was by the Palestine Solidarity group here in Chicago. And could you talk? So this was another more like your first trip, I guess, where you went with an organization, et cetera. If you could talk, and so I'm guessing you had to be careful how you got through security and all that stuff. If you could talk a little bit about that trip and maybe a little bit about the Palestine Solidarity group as well and who they were.
Sure. So the Palestine Solidarity group was made up of we had a number of Palestine members, a number of, people of color, people like me, a large number of activists, particularly that were focused on Palestine. And like I mentioned earlier, our goal was to show these people what was happening in Palestine so they could come back and become activists. And literally all of them did. And actually, one of the people who came back is head of Samud, which is a international Palestine prisoner organization. So there's a lot of people like that. And actually, one of the other people, Michael Letwin, is head of Labor for Palestine. Right. So he does a lot of organizing and unions that, to get them to focus on Palestine. But what happened on this particular trip, I was a member and was going along, and there were some people who had never been there before. And there were some women from the anti-war committee, I believe, in Minneapolis. Is that right? Yeah. So we especially give people instructions, how you should go and not go together or whatever. And they just made a simple mistake, easy enough to make, that they came up together, and the border people were very suspicious, and why are you traveling here together? Anyway, they were put in they have a detention center at the airport. This is Tel Aviv airport. And I heard about this, and I was calling people back here. I found a Jerusalem lawyer, and I said, well, is there something we can do about, getting them out of there because they're going to be deported home? And the Jerusalem lawyer said, I'll go over there and see what I can do. And then I thought, well, the best idea, why don't I call the American embassy? Surely they can do something. And I called them, and they just said, well, actually, there's nothing we can do because, the Israeli government has total control over their borders, and they can let anybody in they want, and they can deport anybody they want. So they eventually got deported. If you want, I can go into the whole thing that happened after that.
Well, why don't you talk a little bit about the trip first? And then
okay.
We'll go into what happened.
Yeah. So that was a trip that we had there were some Palestinian sisters that came on that trip, and they were questioned for, I think it was 8 or 9 hours. And one of the things the Israelis tried to do was they would want your phone, and I want to look at your email. So they were smart enough that they had fake emails that they set up, and so they eventually let them go. So we were pretty happy that at least they got to visit their homeland, because they wouldn't be able to otherwise. And also on that trip, we did spend time in, well, I like to call it apartheid Israel, because I don't really recognize it as a state. But we got into that part of Palestine, and we visited people in Haifa and a couple other cities. And one of the things, of course, we found out, as I mentioned earlier, is that the Palestinians who are still within the apartheid state of Israel, we found out how little rights that they had. And even we talked to a professor that was still teaching there, and, she's kind of pushed off to the side. They really restrict what she says. So one of my, and this is something that you can do. Whenever a Zionist now comes up to me, they always say, oh, well, have you ever been there? And I say, yeah, 4 times. And they'll say, well, those people have equal rights. And I say, no, they don't. And you can use that kind of argument. Even if you haven't been there, you can say, I've listened to somebody or many people who have been there. And even the Palestinians that live within apartheid Israel, they really have no rights, really at all. And all the land in that part of Palestine is all owned by the Israeli government. So you can't build on it. You can't expand your home. If you try to sell it, there'll be some Israeli person that will try to buy it because they want to get as many Palestinians out of there as possible.
Wow. Yeah. No, I mean, I think that's the whole point of Zionism is that, if it's going to be the Jewish state, that only they have rights and abilities, and they govern it the way they see to be. And so, and as they themselves losing a majority, you see more repression and even genocide to try to regain some of that, or trying to expel people from the country. I mean, any Jewish person anywhere in the world can move there and get citizenship automatically right away, whereas people that have lived
and get money to build a house or one of those new beautiful settlements.
Yes, exactly. Whereas if you've lived there your whole life, you can get expelled and lose your citizenship or whatever, or never have it and not have rights. So it's terrible. I want to go to the aftermath of this. You mentioned what happened at the airport, where people were sent back from Minnesota, and later you found out that one of them was working for the FBI, Karen Sullivan, and that there was and there was repression that happened, here in Chicago, but in other cities around the country, in the Midwest especially. Could you talk a little bit about that as well?
Yeah. So we being like the Palestine Solidarity group and the people that went on the delegations, we would always come back and do a report back and give a speech and talk about everything that went on. And we did give one at DePaul that went very well or whatever. And I tried to call one of the people in Minnesota who happened to be this Karen Sullivan, and I said, well, we just did this at DePaul. Would you like us to come up to Minneapolis and do another presentation? And she kind of said, well, yeah, maybe that'd be a good idea. Well, she was the FBI plant. And the reason that she was the FBI plant, I mean, she had joined this organization. And anyway, her idea was that, and this is what came out in the grand jury that I'll talk about in a second. They being the FBI, the horrible organization they are, believed that the Palestine Solidarity Group and the Anti-War Committee in Minneapolis and so on, that we were involved in supporting terrorism, and we were bringing money over to terrorists in Palestine, which of course was untrue. The only money that we paid was like Palestinians would put us up in their homes and, as they like to do. Anyway, so I always thought it was a wonderful, ironic thing that, she was convinced she was going to be on this trip and, see us hand over money to terrorist organizations, and she couldn't even get in the country. So that was the first victory. And as I said, I want to remind people that there have been a number of victories in the activism. Well, the second one, what happened after that is a large number there were two series of subpoenas. There was a grand jury that decided that all of us who had gone on these delegations and so on, that we were giving support to terrorist organizations, and they sent out subpoenas. And even the Palestinian sisters that I mentioned, they got it. Not all, but most of the people who got subpoenas were Palestinians. Others were leaders of some of these organizations, and they literally came into, and it's probably okay to talk about Hatem. Yeah, Hatem Obadiah is one of the most important Palestinian leaders in Chicago. They came into his house, took all this stuff out. He had a young daughter at the time. She had something written. She had drawn in Arabic. They took that out. So all of these people were really under this tremendous pressure for about a year. And what happened was, and this was like, again, another victory of the resistance, all the people in Chicago and in the other cities where this happened all came out in this campaign against this repression. And every single person who got a subpoena refused to testify. So eventually that whole attempt by the FBI and the grand jury and Justice Department just collapsed because they figured out, okay, none of these people are going to testify. So, and again,
it's an important lesson that we, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but for today too, because the repression is, maybe it never went away, but it's being amped up again. And we see that, Trump is, he's deporting people. It takes different forms. But the fact that people stood together, they didn't talk to the FBI, they didn't talk to the grand jury. There was rallies and support and lots of things. This victory came because people stood together and stood behind each other, because that's our power, I think, is standing together. But I'm sorry to interrupt.
It's a very important point. It's one way to look at it is this: refusing to recognize this supposed law or the supposed actions by the FBI or even now ICE. Like, no, I'm sorry, you don't have the right to arrest immigrants or anything like that. And we're going to put our bodies in front of you, and we're going to do everything we can to stop you coming into a school or whatever. But what happened out of this grand jury, the district attorney and the Justice Department obviously got very frustrated. So what they decided to do is to attack one of the most important female Palestinian leaders in Chicago, Rasmia Oda. And she had been a political prisoner in apartheid Israel. She was a tremendous organizer in Chicago. She had an Arab women's group and was very, very supportive. They had a campaign against her because on her, and this happens a lot, when she came and she was a citizen. When she came in to become a citizen, they have questions like, have you ever been in jail, or you ever been committed a crime or whatever? And she had been arrested just because, as I mentioned earlier, if you're a Palestinian that happens to be around when there's some bomb that goes off or something, they just arrest everybody. So it doesn't matter if they have evidence or not. And of course they didn't with her. So it was a very, very long and hard legal campaign that a lot of the same people that fought off the grand jury went to her trials every day in the federal courthouse in Detroit, fighting to keep her here. And she had a PTSD defense. They ignored that. And they didn't want to hear anything about Palestine, or they didn't want to hear anything about the Israelis. And the Israelis would just say, well, we have secret evidence that she was involved in these organizations, but of course we can't show you. What eventually happened, sadly, is that at least she didn't spend a lot of time in jail here, but she was deported to Jordan. And even now, she's still very, very active in Palestinian rights in Jordan, and she's one of the leaders over there.
And she was one of the leaders here, too. I want to just say Rasmia Oda is a name that even today in Chicago, we were at an event just the other night where, the women's committee that she formed was there. There's so much work that she's done here in Chicago in the Arab community, especially amongst women, and getting them to have power and fight for their rights. And so it's a name that our Fight Back Radio listeners maybe know already, but if they don't, you should know that, and you should check that out. I want to pivot a little bit here because we've been talking a lot about Palestine, there's and it's prominent in your book, which I'm encouraging all of our Fight Back Radio listeners to purchase and to read. But you're a white guy from the Midwest. You're a Muslim American. But how did
a Muslim socialist American?
Muslim socialist American, of course. I don't want to leave that part out. But yeah, how did how did you come to activism, and how did it lead to Palestine? So if you could talk a little bit about, and you do in your book about your origins and some of that, but if you could talk a little bit about your early days of activism as well.
So I'll try to give you the bullet points. So I grew up in Detroit at a Catholic Jesuit high school. And one of the classes we had was religion class, social responsibility. And one of the chapters was all about, I was against the Vietnam War this time. And one of the chapters was all about how the Vietnam War was justified in Catholic theology. And I thought, okay, this isn't right. So in the very beginning, this was at the very end of the civil rights movement. So one of the main organizations that I joined at that time, which no one now I find has never heard of, it was actually the first and probably only whites-only organization that fought against racism in the white community. It was around for about 3 or 4 years. One of their tenets, which I still believe today, is that the central contradiction in American society is racism. It takes different forms. Sometimes it's Islamophobia. Sometimes it's against immigrants or whatever. But at the basis, it's a racist institutions that we have and a racist system. And we would all also look at things like the Vietnam War being a racist war. So that, my interest in civil rights and probably some of my Catholic ideals that the church didn't really live up to, got me into activism and this PAR group, People Against Racism. I was very energized by them. We went out and protested against Nixon's inauguration. There was a Black liberation group, Hysteria, that happened in Delaware, where they had this curfew, and it was like they thought the slaves were going to revolt or something. And we all went out there and went on a march with the Black community to challenge the curfew and make sure that didn't happen. A lot of that work went away when the Vietnam War started. And I was very, very involved in the anti-Vietnam War movement. Let's see, I don't know how much farther you want me to.
Well, let's. How did you get from that to? I mean, because the title.
Oh, that to Palestine.
Oh no, to
Ireland. Or even
to
Ireland. Yeah,
to Ireland, because the title of your book talks about from Ireland to Palestine.
Yeah, so that's
how did you get from that to Ireland?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So when I got a little older and just think of my interest in civil rights and anti-racism and so on. I went to Ireland on the first trip with my mother and my brother. And around that time, I was reading a lot about what was going on in Ireland. And this was when there was the major battles between the IRA and the loyalist paramilitary groups.
That's the Irish Republican Army.
Irish Republican Army. And there's a lot of acronyms on the other side of the pro-British people. But just think of them overall, they're called loyalists. And if you can think of like the Ku Klux Klan, like people that are racist and hate Jews. And in this case, they hated Catholics or anybody who liked Ireland or liked a united Ireland. And they were a paramilitary group, and they would shoot, Irish civilians and bomb them. And okay, so that whole battle was going on. At the beginning, the most important part of that was in 1972, there was an attempt on the part of the people in the north of Ireland. And by the way, You should not call it Northern Ireland. It's the north of Ireland. If you're an Irish Republican, you do not recognize that as a British occupied country or part of Ireland, which is what it is. But anyway.
So let me just go back though. So, I mean, just for people that don't know, I mean, Ireland was, all of Ireland was occupied by England for
800 years.
800 years. And so then there was an independence movement in 1916 was when they celebrate the Easter Uprising. And so they won independence for all of Ireland except 6 counties in the north.
6 counties in the north. And that was because those 6 counties had a majority of pro-British citizens. And they wanted to make sure that, it's like redistricting or something that would happen here. Okay, you want to make sure there's not too many black people here, even though, there's this whole area. So we're going to put all the white people over here, so they're a majority, even though in the area they're really not. So it was a way of keeping the pro-British people in control. So that's why there's been battles going on ever since. The Irish Republican movement and like the IRA has been fighting this campaign for equal rights, number one, for the pro-Irish, what you call them, nationalists that are in the north of Ireland, and for them because they're very much oppressed. They don't have any rights. They can't get jobs. Housing is terrible, and so on. So that's why that what you used to call the Troubles or whatever. That's why that war has been going on and on and on for a very, very long time.
Yeah. And so, let me then ask, it seems like that lays the basis as well. I want to go back to Palestine here a little bit for, you're part of a group, Ireland for Palestine.
Yeah. Chicago Irish for Palestine.
And, and that there's, a lot of, the rhetoric coming out of different, the country of Ireland, as well as, Sinn Féin, the party in the north and the south now too. Have been more pro-Palestinian and more supportive of Palestinian rights and critical of the Zionist state. So can you talk a little bit about Irish for Palestine and how that all, how this all kind of maybe comes back together again today?
It comes back together. The one important thing to remember is that all of Ireland, even the north, has always been supportive of liberation movements, and particularly Palestine. They were supportive of the Basque country. They were supportive of
Spain,
African country, north of Spain. Yeah. They were supportive of the African, liberation movements. South Africa, they're critical to supporting their overthrow of the apartheid government. So people there are terrific Palestine supporters. What happened over the years is that, of course, a lot of Irish came to cities like Chicago, and they were treated like crap in the beginning. But, the second and third generation became judges and policemen and lawyers, and, they got the power. So what happened, they kind of forgot about the old country that they seemed to love so much on St. Patrick's Day. So one of the goals of the Chicago Irish for Palestine, and there's a few, there's one in St. Louis and one in Detroit. Our goal is two things. One is to organize within the Irish American community, because the Irish American community, only part of it supports Palestine and those kind of liberation movements. And to be blunt, the other part tends to be extremely racist. So our goal, just like I mentioned with People Against Racism in the very beginning, is to organize within our own community. So we had a number of actions on St. Patrick's Day that some of the people didn't like very much, which was in support of Palestine. And we've done we had a very successful fundraiser at the Irish American Heritage Center, which I don't think they've ever had. So our second goal, obviously, is to support Palestinians and support that liberation movement and so on. So we do a lot of, we're part of a lot of the, like the Gaza protests, and we do a lot of fundraisers for Palestinian organizations.
Okay. And so I know in your book, you reprint an article you wrote about the boycott, divest, sanctions. And it was around the time of Ramadan, I think, where you taught it was like more than dates boycotting.
Yeah.
And so as a tactic, I want to go back to the BDS thing. Could you tell people, our Fight Back Radio listeners, a little bit about what BDS is and how to make it effective, in your view, how to make it effective?
Yeah.
I mean, more than dates in this case, but
Sure.
What then?
Yeah. So one important fact that you can probably win a, trivia contest in a place, in a bar or whatever you're in. Boycott was invented by Irish revolutionaries. And there actually was, and I won't go in a lot of detail about this, but there was actually a Captain Boycott. He was a landowner representative at the time when the British landowners were kicking out tenant farmers and that type of thing. So what they did, and this has relevance for today, what they did is they totally boycotted him as an individual. They would not work for him. They wouldn't sell him anything. They wouldn't talk to him. And actually that ended up leading to this land war that was enabled a lot of the tenant farmers to get their rights back. Well, going back to the present, the BDS movement is boycott, divestment, sanctions. That has been going on and been called by the Palestinian Civil Society like since 2005, something like that. And the boycott idea is right now it's to boycott any companies or organizations or that do business with Israel, that fund their occupation, and definitely not by dates or any other produce that is created from Israel. Divestment has to do, and you've seen a lot of this in the college encampments, that there was 80 colleges had encampments to support Palestine. And all of those, their goal was to stop their university from investing in these same companies that had investments in Israel. And sanctions isn't used as much. So we really focused on boycott and divestment. So bringing that up to today, one of the things that you can see happening, and I don't know if we could probably go into this a little bit about, in my book, one of the things that I talk about at the end are effective tactics for Trump resistance. And a lot of these came out of the Palestine movement and the BDS movement and so on. So one of the things is boycotts. And you've probably heard a lot about when the Trump administration eliminated diversity, equality, and investment across the federal government. There were certain companies that decided that they were going to eliminate any diversity on their websites or their department that they had. So what's happening right now, and this is a very good example of the kind of boycott. In this case, it's not for Israel, but that can be very effective. You focus on just a very few targets. So in this case, it's hopefully I'm not using a pun. The target is Amazon, Target, and Walmart, because those are three of the companies that have wiped anything about diversity out of their company. So people now, including me and a lot of other people, are not shopping at those stores anymore. And the important thing is not to have too many targets, but to have a select few and make sure that people can get whatever that Walmart or Amazon would sell from other places. So that's come out of the excuse me. That's come out of the Palestine BDS movement, where we talked about the dates. There was a Caterpillar boycott. There's been a number of other boycotts that have actually been successful. But the thing to remember is that they take a long time. Just think about how successful the BDS movement was against South Africa. And a lot of people don't remember that lasted about 10 years. But it was incredibly effective because the only countries at the end to support South Africa was the United States and Israel. But that had a big impact. So small number of targets, make sure there's something that people recognize. Everybody knows Walmart or whatever. And if you're in the Muslim community, you know a lot about dates, and you know a lot about not buying any dates that are from Israel or other kinds of products like hummus or whatever. So that's kind of one of the focuses.
No, that's good. I think that's good. And I want to, just we're starting to wind down here a little bit, but there was I saw you at the March on the Democratic National Convention, and we were at that time we were upset with the Democrats because they continued and refused to slow down their support for the genocide that was going on in Palestine. But since then, and Trump was saying the same thing, but since then, Trump has been elected president of the United States. In some ways, the repression has gotten worse. His attacks on universities and on others, and so here we are, in middle part of 2025. What should we be? What should activists be doing? How should we be looking to resist Trump and the Trump agenda? How does Palestine fit into that? We haven't gotten into it, but it's in your book, and so I encourage people to buy it. You also talk about your activism around police accountability and some other things. You've written extensively on these issues. So how should we be approaching the Trump administration and trying to have a people's agenda?
Yeah. So at the end of my book, I talk about, I have a whole chapter on resistance to Trump. And it's important to have a multi-pronged approach, which sounds kind of obvious, but one of the dangers that I've seen so far is, every day Trump comes up with, some new crazy thing. And that's on purpose because he wants to scatter all the resistance against him or whatever. So going back to tactics, we've already talked about boycott. If you've noticed that the Tesla boycott dropped their sales by about 70-some%. And we've already talked about the DEI, the different companies. One of the other things that's one of my favorite things is disruption. So you'll probably notice I don't go into a lot of detail in the book about that on purpose, but an example of disruption that was learned and very successful from the Palestine Solidarity movement was whenever Israeli prime minister or defense minister or anybody who would try to come to Chicago, there was a huge crowd and they weren't allowed to speak. And basically, they never came back. And a lot of you might remember on the first Trump administration, when he was running, he tried to come to Chicago and do a speech at the UIC pavilion. Well, there were about 5,000 people, including me, and lots of them were UIC students. And they were determined, we're not going to let this guy come to Chicago and talk. And about half of the people, including me, that were inside the pavilion were protesters. So he gave it up. He said, "Oh, the police told me there was a chance of violence," which was, and then the CPD police department came out later and said, "No, there wasn't." So, we ran him out of town. So another example of that, you've probably seen, there has been disruptions of Representative Sean Casten. He's tried to do town halls, and every one of them has been disrupted by Palestinian groups, also Chicago Irish for Palestine, that, his largest constituency is Palestinians. And he's refused to meet with them for over a year. He won't talk about Gaza, stopping the genocide. He's a huge Israel supporter, always votes for the military aid. Somebody like that doesn't deserve to talk and doesn't deserve to ignore Palestine and genocide as an issue. So those are the kind, when I talk about disruption, those are the kinds of things that I'm talking about. And it's focused. It could be focused on this senator or focused on this issue. And even I know a lot of schools, like my son works at College of DuPage, and I've heard this from hospitals and so on. They're getting very organized to not allow ICE to come into their hospital, to come into their school. What happens if they do? And there's been a number of instances where they've tried to show up and no, you're not coming in here.
Yeah.
And that's part of learning. That kind of also came out of the Irish liberation movement. It's like not recognizing that as a law. These ICE guys, they don't have a warrant. They have no reason to arrest people with green cards or anybody else without due process. So they don't have any right to come into your workplace or your school or whatever.
Yeah, that's exactly. And I know the Chicago Teachers Union has put that in their collective bargaining agreements. And, now we have a mayor and a school board that's actually has sympathy with what what the people have pushed for. So those are good things. Unfortunately, our time is winding down here. Are there any points that you want to raise here that we haven't yet in this interview, or anything you want to tell our Fight Back Radio listeners?
I think one of the, and I hope this is one of the important themes of my book. It covers 60 years of activism in Chicago. And I want to remind people, particularly new activists, that we have had many successes and we've had many victories. And with good tactics, we've done very well. Often it doesn't seem that way, but whenever the people, and I'm talking about broad coalitions of people, have got together, they've stopped oppression or whatever it is from happening. And also protected people that are vulnerable. So always remember that. If you do happen to be white, and we probably have a few people that are white on this radio show.
I'm guessing it's very diverse. We got everybody there.
But, if you're white, take advantage of your white privilege and make sure that you can get into places. I always like, wearing a suit and tie and then go in and disrupt whatever I want to disrupt because they don't expect me to do that. So that's a very, very important message I definitely want to get across to people.
So then your book is My Chicago Activist Life from Ireland to Palestine, 1968 to 2025. How can our Fight Back Radio listeners get your book?
Well, the best way to get it is from barnesandnoble.com. And if you just search for My Chicago Activist Life, it comes up right away. They don't have too many other books with that name. It is also on Amazon. So if you feel forced to get it from Amazon, you can do that. But as I said, we're trying to boycott them. and it's not a lot of money. It's $20, and it's the ebook is like $10. And the last thing I'll say, and I've been doing a lot of this, if you're an organization that wants to do a fundraiser, I've done a number of fundraisers for organizations where I give a presentation of my book, and I give all the funds to whatever that fundraiser is. So I'm always happy to do that, and I've done a couple of those actually already.
Okay. So if people are interested in that, you can contact Fight Back Radio, and we can get the information to Bill. You can reach us at richard.fightbackradio@gmail.com. So that's one way you can do that. So thank you for being our guest on Fight
Appreciate
Back Radio.
Thanks for inviting me.
All right.
This was great.
Okay, so there's a lot there in this book. Bill Chambers' book, My Chicago Activist Life, from Ireland to Palestine, 1968 to 2025. And we just started to scratch the surface. I really suggest people go out and purchase this book. There's a whole section there on how Bill became involved in social justice and attracted to Islam, particularly the W. Dean Muhammad section of Islam, and his work with Black Lives Matter we didn't really touch on. And there's so much more about Ireland in the book that we just barely scratched the surface, and for that matter, Palestine too. So I encourage people to go out and buy Bill's book. I think you'll enjoy it. And I want to also, just before we go off today, we had the award I was talked about in previous episodes that I received, the Pete Camerata Award, and I was truly honored to receive this award from the Freedom Road Socialist Organization. And so I want to thank them for this, and all the people that showed up to support me and the other award winners as well. So that was very nice, and it was a great event. And so I encourage you all to check out Freedom Road Socialist Organization. Also, I want to encourage everybody to check out Fight Back News, the news and views from the people's struggles. And finally, I think we just passed our 3-year anniversary here, and it's been the support we've gotten from everybody's been spectacular. I really appreciate that people have tuned in to Fight Back Radio. We're approaching 100,000 listens, if you can believe that, and we have about 3,000 subscribers. So if you're not one of those subscribers, like or subscribe or whatever, and also I'd encourage people to hit the give us 5 stars or write a review or a reply saying something nice. Send this off to other people so that they can have it. And then the other thing I wanted to do before we went off the air is because we just passed International Workers' Day, or May Day, which commemorates the martyrs from Chicago who fought for the 8-hour day, the revolutionary trade unionists, 5 of which were killed because of it, and 3 of which spent an enormous amount of time in jail. And even though they were sentenced to death, the movement was able to get them out and save their lives. But I want to just mention their names here for our Fight Back Radio listeners, and for everyone, just to remember these names of Albert Parsons, August Spies, Adolf Fischer, George Engel, Louis Ling, Michael Schwab, Oscar Neebe, and Samuel Fielden. Those are the 8 Haymarket martyrs. And then finally, I want to, as always, thank our Fight Back Radio production team, Fayani Aboma Majana, as well as Lane Dorsey, Dodd McColgan, Vince Olson, Shane Tremley, and Natalie Pranis. And I'm Richard Berg for the entire Fight Back Radio team, saying until next time, all power to the people.